Hi, my name is Zach Huffman, and today we're going to go over the 2025-2026 PCA Pocket Coach Academy policy brief. The topic for this year is resolved. The United States federal government should significantly increase its exploration and/or development of the Arctic. So just a quick resolutional breakdown. What this is telling us is that affirmative teams have to significantly increase exploration and or, meaning it can be both or one or the other, and or development of the Arctic. So this is saying that affirmative teams have to somehow increase exploration, have to somehow increase development, or both in the Arctic, and they have to prove that that is a significant increase. So let's go over just a couple of things that we have within the brief. Starting off, we have the Green Tech Affirmative. So the Green Tech Affirmative is essentially a way to increase the exploration and development of the Arctic in order to essentially increase the amount of green technology, things like solar panel technology, renewable energy for the United States. So the way that we have these apps structured is with plan coming first, then the advantages that have solvency kind of embedded within them, right? So to start off with the plan on the Green Tech app, it is the United States federal government should significantly increase its exploration and development of the Arctic to stabilize critical raw material supply chains, including, and this is all going to be included in the plan, develop innovation centers to research and develop solutions that support stable domestic supplies of critical materials, establish domestic mineral policies that mitigate criticality fluctuation risk for mineral investment, engage with smelting and refining facilities in the Americas and in geopolitically aligned countries to assess their capacities to recover critical materials from Alaskan ores, develop process modification strategies to recover critical materials not currently recovered, and engage with industry to develop recovery circuits for critical minerals at existing and developing mines. So, first question you probably have is how do we find all of this? How do we come up with any of this? Who supports this? Well, we have this comes from a specific Arctic researcher named Brett Watson, who essentially is focused on critical materials within the Arctic that are necessary for renewable material and other green technology. So this is a piece of evidence that supports that, but we also have more that supports it because, with all of those different planks within the plan, you probably need something that supports each one of those things, which we have for plank one, plank two, plank three and four, and then plank five. We have pieces of evidence that explain why each individual plank is going to be necessary for the plan to resolve the impacts. So, what are those impacts? This is when we get into the contentions of the 1AC. It starts off with warming. I'm not going to go into super big detail into what each of the cards actually say, but more so just kind of how they're used in the debate round. So, in terms of like the warrant itself, you're going to need to go in and read the evidence yourself so you can kind of get a better grasp of what exactly the tagline is saying and what the warrant behind the tagline is. But we're just going to focus more on like what the purpose of the card is as opposed to what the card is actually saying. So this first Litninol 24 card is basically your uniqueness argument for warming that's saying it's happening now, it's happening quickly, and we have to lower our emissions in order to prevent self-perpetuating warming, which is essentially a cycle of warming where it the atmosphere gets so hot that it melts a bunch of the ice and on the Arctic and the Antarctic. And the thing about those um, huge ice caps is that they contain a lot of carbon, which means if they melt, they emit more carbon into the atmosphere, which heats up the atmosphere anymore and melts more ice. And that creates a cycle that is kind of irreversible. So the argument that this evidence is making is that if we can lower the amount of emissions we are currently emitting as rapidly as possible, then we could prevent self-perpetuating warming. And it's try or die, meaning that we have to do that or the cycle will happen and we will eventually die from too much carbon in the atmosphere that creates a ton of climate change, accelerated warming that just makes the Earth hotter and disrupts the climate cycles of the Earth. So that goes into the Sprat 24 evidence that says that short-term, near-term emission reductions have increasing value for preventing the risk of extinction, meaning that essentially the closer we get to those tipping points means that the more valuable, short-term emission reductions are because we need to, one, stop the amount of emissions that we're doing right now, and then we can create a more long-term solution. So it's essentially saying that we have to find a way to sustain the Earth as it is, sustain all of the energy we're consuming without using high-emitting technology, which is going to be things like coal, oil, natural gas. So we need to have other technologies that can lower those emissions. The Bartuka 25 evidence is essentially saying that the current scenario that we're in, the high emission scenario, is going to create massive species loss that results in a global extinction, which is why we need to have other technology to decrease our emissions, so we're no longer in a high emission scenario. That goes into some Watson evidence. You're going to see that Watson et al. Is the main author in a lot in this AF, because that is where we're getting the critical material supply chains evidence from that supports why developing in the Arctic is key to developing those low emission technologies. So the first piece of evidence says that bottlenecked supply chains for critical materials prevent the development of green technology. This is basically saying that the United States and industries have a hard time developing green technology in the status quo because there are supply chains that are not as accessible. That's for a lot of reasons, international trade with other countries, but also just that the United States doesn't have a ton of natural resources that support the development of renewable energy or green technology, except for in Alaska, which is untapped because there are tons of bottlenecks in industry that prevent people from being able to go in and mine in Alaska to find those critical resources that are necessary. So the next piece of Watson evidence is saying that if we can strengthen and stabilize that supply chain, then it'll be a crucial step to the development of green technology. That basically means we need to have better routes available for getting the raw materials, going to them, mining them, and then bringing those materials back. Is essentially what we mean by supply chain, and just the availability for industry to get those resources. So if we can use the plan to strengthen that supply chain, make it easier to go to the spot, mine the ore, and come back from the spot, then it'll be easier to develop green technology, and industry would have a better incentive to. So the final piece of Watson et al. Evidence in this contention is saying that that would accelerate the development of green and clean energy technologies because it allows for the United States to supply itself and supply the industry in the United States to develop that green technology, which is how we can resolve warming. So the next contention we have is about technological war, specifically with China, and how that the United States needs to develop these technologies to maintain its market dominance over China, and ensure that the United States maintains influence in certain parts of the world. So the Allen et al. 25 evidence is saying that China is locking in market dominance now, basically saying that they are developing green technology and renewable energy, and kind of cornering the market on it right now, and the United States is lagging behind. So the United States needs to have more innovative technologies to help leapfrog the Chinese supply. We need to have more better supply chains in order for us to overcome the Chinese supply of critical materials. So right now, as Miller, Verta, and Thier wrote, 25 evidence is saying that China is cornering the European green energy market right now. So European companies are buying technology and materials from China instead of from the United States because we just simply do not have them, which is why it's important for us to have those resources available so we can engage in the European green energy market instead of China, who is currently just consolidating a ton of influence in the European Union as opposed to the United States through its green energy market. So the next piece of evidence says that that will give China a foothold into grid planning, where essentially China, because they are the main suppliers of the technologies, are going to be able to work with these European countries to plan their grids, plan how they power the entire country. And a lot of European allies do not want that because they don't want to depend on China for their power grid. They don't want to give China that necessary power, and they would rather give that power to a more stable ally like the United States, which is why we have to develop these technologies to give them that option. So the next piece of evidence is saying that the United States can recapture the market with renewable energy if we have the critical materials necessary to sell to these and to sell to the industry to develop these technologies, and then for United States industry to develop and then sell to European industry as well. Otherwise, China will become the main energy supplier of the European Union, and that can fracture a lot of the European Union because a lot of the different countries are either for or against Chinese dependence on that energy, which can cause a lot of conflict there. For example, Russia is a partner of China and will probably try to force Chinese depend or countries to depend on China, like countries such as in the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, maybe Ukraine, which is a key hotbed right now. Tons of countries in Europe might be persuaded to, be dependent on Chinese infrastructure, and then you're going to have countries such as the United Kingdom and Germany and France who are going to be like the powerhouses of the European Union that are going to want to back United States influence in the regions, which can fracture a lot of the goals and development that the European Union has. And technically, the United Kingdom is not part of the European Union, but they are part of the European green energy market, which is still a huge part of this. Finally, or not finally, but these two cards are kind of the final argument here. The Beeson 25 evidence says that if you have a strong European Union, it prevents European conflict from happening. There are a couple of spheres of influence where conflict might be arising now. Look at things like Ukraine. Not to mention that, the Trump administration has sort of emboldened tensions in Europe right now, which is causing a lot of countries to sort of choose sides. That's never good. But if we have a strong European Union, it will prevent a lot of that from escalating into actual war. And then finally, it says that a strong European Union checks other risks, things like trade wars, just multilateral issues like conflicts, pandemics. If you have a strong European Union, then those countries can act together, which will be a better way to check those risks. So that is the green tech affirmative. I'm not going to go into the extensions or anything for the sake of time, but these are just going to have basic explanations of what the affirmative does and then supporting pieces of evidence. So that's green tech. Next, we're going to go into UNCLOS, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This has a key piece of contention in the Arctic because most Arctic exploration and development does happen through sea routes. So having a governing body over how the laws of those sea routes is probably a necessary thing. So this affirmative is once again, plan and then contentions with solvency built in. Plan: the United States federal government should fully ratify the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So this is basically just a regulatory policy that just kind of governs how countries interact with each other in the sea. For example, if Russia and the United States have ships that are crossing the same paths, how do those interact with each other? How do you prevent conflict from occurring in there? That's basically what UNCLOS does. And there's more detail in the actual evidence. But getting into the security contention itself, the argument is that ratifying UNCLOS is necessary. So the United States is technically party to UNCLOS, and a lot of European countries and China are party to UNCLOS. But the United States has not fully ratified it, which basically means Congress hasn't voted to make them like an official member of UNCLOS, and we don't fully fund it the way that we should. So ratification is basically what the affirmative is revolved around, because ratification is necessary to build the United States influence within UNCLOS, which makes it a more enforceable piece of legislation because it allows the United States to fully back it and create more rules-based pressure that deters adversaries like China and Russia and can actually enforce economic sanctions on aggressive action within the Arctic that prevents conflict from arising. For example, China has what they call military alert zones, where they're kind of like heightened. They self-inflate tensions in certain regions in order to prevent other countries from getting into those areas. United States ratification of UNCLOS would deter China from doing those sorts of things because they actually have to answer to the United States in that situation where it is ratified. So this piece of evidence says that UNCLOS is preventing conflicts among great powers now, but there is a lot of tension that might not get resolved by UNCLOS, so continued pressure is necessary, which is where ratification comes in, where the United States can actually enforce something and make rules for UNCLOS that would prevent things like Chinese or Russian aggression in the region. So this piece of evidence says that if there is conflict in the Arctic, it will go nuclear. And the reason for that, because countries like China and Russia, and especially the United States, are battling for influence in the region. And they really want this influence because of the energy resources that are in the Arctic. And not to mention the development of military bases there. So there's a lot of oil in the Arctic. There's a lot of renewable energy resources in the Arctic. So countries will risk a lot to kind of have the most influence and have the most access to those resources there, which is why they're willing to do things such as launch nuclear war to protect their interests, which is why you have to try to prevent in every aspect conflict from occurring, which is the basis of the affirmative through ratification of UNCLOS. Kind of already gone over what the basis of this argument is, but this piece of evidence says that actual ratification would disincentivize Chinese and Russian adventurism or aggression in the region, because the United States would once again be a true like norm setter, a true enforcer of UNCLOS, as opposed to just kind of obeying the laws of UNCLOS instead of actually creating some and enforcing their own. Um, Next, this piece of evidence says that UNCLOS allows for legitimate dialogue instead of conflict. It would, this evidence says that it would sway China and Russia away from engaging, in hostilities and instead kind of working towards restraint and ensuring that they talk to each other before doing things like launching weapons at each other's ships, ensuring that there is a space for dialogue in the region, which is essentially key, or why UCLOS is necessary and the ratification is necessary. As literally, like the first sentence says, as a non-party to UCLOS, the U.S. lacks a seat at the table, which means that the United States lacks like true voice in terms of UCLOS. This piece of evidence once again supports that United States involvement is the necessary step to ensure the enforceability of UNCLOS and ensure that while it is sort of preventing conflict now, it prevents it in the future and prevents it from the incoming and very contemporary development of the Arctic from these three major parties like the United States, China, and Russia, who are seeking more and more influence in the region, which is why we have to strengthen UNCLOS before too much development in the region occurs. So the next contention is about the environment. We've actually gone over this part in the previous affirmative, that just saying that currently there's a lot of high emission, there's the high emission scenario that's going to lead to extinction due to high carbon emissions in the current energy market. However, different solution this time with a different affirmative. We have UNCLOS being a necessary step to prevent environmental collapse. So the ocean is currently, collapsing because it's getting hotter. That is due to, like I said before, in the previous affirmative, high emissions, high carbon emissions are causing the ocean to get warmer. Ice is melting, emitting more carbon into the atmosphere, making the oceans hotter. It's basically turning the ocean into fish soup. And that is why UNCLOS can be a way to resolve that. Because if there are laws on what ships can do, what countries can do in the sea, it can help ensure environmental protections are met. Not to mention, it encourages cooperative research instead of combative research, or where the United States wants to hold its own research, China wants to hold its own research, Russia wants to hold its own research. You can share that research a lot better if UNCLOS is involved, because it kind of gives these countries an incentive to share their research through cooperative dialogue that UNCLOS provides. For example, like this evidence said, UNCLOS creates credible and legitimate dialogue. So this swelling evidence is saying that that can also apply to ocean governance and can apply to the way that oceans are currently maintained in the current status quo, right? So Rogers evidence says that ocean health is key to preventing extinction because the ocean is probably the most complex ecosystem on the earth, and without the ocean, everything else falls apart. So ensuring ocean health is necessary to prevent extinction, mostly because of keystone species that are within the ocean that prevent or that drive a lot of weather systems, that drive just ecosystems in general that are necessary for the health of the entire climate, not just the ocean climate. Also, to resolve a lot of the high emissions, through UNCLOS, the plan also develops a huge R&D portfolio, research and development portfolio, because it allows for these countries to work together to build up their own low carbon technology that would help reduce the high emission scenario. And having UNCLOS a part of that will allow for these countries to interact with one another, um, and better develop those things. And finally, we have another piece of Watson evidence actually from the last staff that explains that the plans of research and ensuring that critical materials are part of that research would have developed the clean energy technologies necessary to prevent the high emission scenario. So that is the UNCLOS app, and that is actually everything we're going to go over on the app side. Those are the two big apps we have on this brief. They're huge and they have a lot of supporting evidence. But getting into the negative side, we can go over some topicality shells that we currently have in the brief. So just go over a few. First is T, no private actors. This is basically just saying that if a plan uses non-government organizations or the private sector as a part of its affirmative, then that would be non-topical, whether that be, for example, like even on this green tech app, right? Engaging with industry to develop recovery circuits, right? That could be seen as involving and relying on the private sector or non-governmental organizations that might even bite this topicality shell here. But this is basically just saying that if you include private sector or NGOs, then it creates a huge explosion of, oh, almost knocked over my water. It creates a huge explosion of affirmatives because you have to think about what literally maybe every single company in the United States could do in the Arctic and with the government. You have to think about what maybe Amazon could do as an affirmative in cooperation with the government, or Ocean Gate, whatever those companies are, and how they can interact with the government. You shouldn't have to, as when you're preparing on the negative side, you shouldn't have to prepare for all of those things, which is what the purpose of this topicality is saying that you need to limit your affirmatives to only governmental action and governmental action only. The next topicality shell we can go over is data collection. So this is basically saying that exploration and development require the observation of data and then the installation of infrastructure, and that requires permanent infrastructure. And that is basically a way to define exploration and development in a way that limits affirmatives once more. This is really going to be best against an icebreaker affirmative because icebreaker affirmatives are not permanent infrastructure and they do not develop, they do not involve any data collection. And icebreakers is probably the most popular affirmative on this topic. So reading this against an icebreakers app is really good because one, they're not permanent structures in the Arctic. They are moving, obviously, icebreaker ships, and they don't do any data collection. So that could be a way that you could say that icebreakers are not exploration or development, even if we are, quote, building things in the Arctic. And they might be doing, icebreakers might be doing really good things in the Arctic. They are not specifically exploration or development. So yeah, for the reason that that is a topicality shell is because if you include what the main action of icebreakers are, which is military patrols and just increased shipping, that could be a ton of different affirmatives that you have to prepare for. You might have to prepare for United States should increase its exploration of the Arctic by putting a military patrol off of the coast of Alaska, specifically, one of the island regions. And that might be topical under like a vacuum reading of the resolution. But when you don't define things like exploration or development, then they can get away with things like that. And you don't want to have to prepare for, a military patrol on one island in Alaska versus another AF as a military patrol on another island in Alaska. And you might not just have specific evidence against those things, which is why it's necessary to define and narrow down what exploration and development specifically are. And this T says it's infrastructure development or data collection, which is a really good way to limit affirmatives. And if they're not very good at answering specific topicalities, this could be a really good way to win a round on simply just you have evidence that describes what exploration and development is in a more specific way than they do. And that could be a really useful tool. Another T shell we have is node conservation AF or node conservation AF, which is basically saying that you can't do an AF that is simply doing conservation in the Arctic. It defines development distinct from conservation through the term sustainable development, which is distinct from development itself, which is what this evidence is saying, is that you can have development, which is building economic, political, or social implications, or you can have sustainable development, which is basically adding a caveat to the concept of development, saying that, you can't develop if you're doing these things on the environment. That is not development in itself. That is a limit on development. Whether that's good or bad is a different question, but it's still a limit on that development. Um, so you're probably going to run into a lot of conservation apps, and that's truly one that I think would be not topical because it's not actually increasing development. If anything, it is decreasing development by imposing those regulations on conservation. Another good T we have is that you must search or extract resources, which is very similar to the second one we had here about requiring data collection. But this one's a little bit more broad. So this is saying that in order to explore or develop, it has to be tied to resources, and you have to search for those resources or extract those resources. And this is very specific in the context of exploration and development together, which is why we have two different paragraphs here, defining exploration and then right after it defining development and saying how those two things interact with each other. So if the affirmative does not search for or extract minerals, then you could say that it is not necessarily topical. All right, I'm not going to go over like the specific, all the definitions we have for all of these different words because that's not really necessary. But we will get into a lot of the different counterplans that we have here. So starting off with the Arctic Council counterplan, probably the biggest one we have that you could use generically against a lot of different affirmatives. This is saying that the counterplan text itself is that the USFG should increase its engagement with the Arctic Council, supporting Russia's participation in the council, increasing collaborative scientific research, developing a new Arctic Council forum for security discussions, and cooperatively engaging with other Arctic nations. So this is saying instead of doing the affirmative, we should just increase our participation in the Arctic Council and then just increase our research and collaboration with all the countries in the Arctic Council. That would probably resolve the affirmative's impacts. The big part of the counterplan is that it supports Russia's participation in the council. And a lot of the affirmatives you're going to be debating are going to be focused on Russia. There are already a lot of countries within the Arctic Council. I don't know specifically all of them, but I know like some of the base that you would think, right? The United States is a part of it because of Alaska, and that's we're an Arctic state because we have a state that is in the Arctic. Canada is an Arctic state. Russia is an Arctic state. They just don't really participate in the council very much. China, they claim themselves to be an Arctic state. Whether they are or not is debatable, but they do reach pretty far north, so you might be able to say they're Arctic. What other countries? Finland, Norway, Sweden, Iceland. Those are all Greenland, which is technically Denmark. So Denmark. Those are all Arctic states, and I believe they're all a part of the Arctic Council. So the United States does participate in the Arctic Council, but not very much, which is why we're saying that Washington should specifically increase its participation in there. To ensure that we might be able to work out security concerns instead of engaging in like hostile acts, and probably going to be able to resolve a lot of the impacts that are on the affirmative, right? And that's why we have these extensions here that say we solve a lot of things. Counterplan solves resource development, it solves climate change, it solves security, it solves science diplomacy, it solves Russian conflict. This is where you could say that even if they have a very specific AF, you don't always need to do exactly what the AF does to solve the AF. If you can solve the AF's impacts and solve the internal link chains that go into those impacts, then you're solving the AF. You don't necessarily have to do the plan to do that, which is what these pieces of evidence are saying, and what you need these pieces of evidence for. So next we have the law, the Sea Treaty, UNCLOS. I know affirmative and negative with UNCLOS. You could argue that either one of them is not topical. You could argue that the affirmative is not topical and read the counterplan, or you could say that the counterplan is topical and that it's not good. But I've seen it both ways from camps coming out saying that it could be topical or not topical. So the brief prepares you either way. And this counterplan is saying that instead of doing the affirmative, they should ratify the UN Convention of the Law on the Sea, or UNCLOS. It's also called LOS. There are a lot of different acronyms for it. But this is basically would be an AF that you could read against or a counterplan that you could read against an AF that has to do with Chinese or Russian aggression. And if they, for example, are reading an AF that is similar to the UNCLOS AF, but the plan might not be UNCLOS, and you could probably read the UNCLOS counterplan and say that solves the AF instead, and then read a dissad that is a net benefit for it. Ooh, see, sometimes I go through here and I see typos. I solved them, but I've already released the brief. So what's the point? But this piece of evidence is basically more supporting evidence, almost of the affirmative, that says that the United States ratification of UNCLOS would enable us to work better with our competitors like China and Russia and prevent conflict from occurring. Once again, we have a bunch of different solvency cards that say that this solves a lot of different impacts and internal link chains that you could claim would solve the affirmative. So the other counterplans we have here are advantage counterplans, which are basically saying, like, if they have a warming advantage and you want to solve that and you think solving that is the most important thing, and then you can read a disad, saying the plan shouldn't happen. Here's a counterplan to resolve the warming advantage. Disad links to the affirmative. That's a net benefit, vote neg. So that's what an advantage counterplan is. We do have a video in PCA going over that if you want to go more into detail on how to use advantage counterplan. But these are basically just going to be very specific actions that you can use to resolve, warming that has nothing to do with the Arctic, right? So this is going to be like a cap and trade system for carbon dioxide. So I'm not going to go over like the specifics of each one of these because you really only need them if you're going to be specifically arguing against a Taiwan advantage and you don't want to read a counterplan that solves the entirety of the AF. You only want to solve, say, Taiwan advantage, because maybe you have impact turns and link turns on one of the other advantages, and you don't want to necessarily solve that one. Did you think that not solving that one is actually a good thing because you have impact turns? So that's where you would read like advantage counterplan on one of the advantages so that you could still use your counterplan disad strategy of zero in the affirmative. So we have a few here, like Arctic trade counterplan that would resolve things like multilateralism, tech leadership, which is a way to resolve, the Chinese tech war without actually doing anything related to the Arctic. So those are some of the counterplans that we have. Next, we'll get into the main disads that we got going here. And really, I really truly think that there are only going to be two like good disadvantages on this topic. There are going to be a lot of like economic related disadvantages on exploration and development of the Arctic, but I think the main ones that are the easiest to win are going to be United States action makes Russia or China angry. And what does that actually result in? So on the Russian relations disad, we actually have two different scenarios. We have Russian cooperation, which is saying that United States-Russian cooperation is high and it helps de-escalate conflict, and that the plan's action ruins cooperation because the plan would be a unilateral action that hurts relations with Russia, and that would essentially cause Russia to no longer cooperate with the United States and probably create some sort of conflict that would ensure extinction because Russia is going to get mad. They're probably going to get mad over Ukraine, and they're probably going to do something like nuke the United States somewhere or nuke Ukraine somewhere because they didn't get their way in the Arctic, and the United States was not working with them in the Arctic anymore and was not able to prevent them from doing something like nuking Ukraine. Another scenario for the disadvantage is a little bit longer. This one says that relations with Russia are rebounding post-Biden. Specifically, it says the Arctic is necessary for that, and that talking within the Arctic is key to the development of relations with, the Trump administration and Putin's Kremlin. This piece of evidence is saying that United States action within the Arctic would harm that relationship and cause military tension because if we're not working directly with Russia on action in the Arctic, then it can be seen as an act of aggression almost. The next piece of evidence says that, nuclear peace, not even just peace in general, just nuclear peace, as in preventing Russia from launching a nuclear weapon, is dependent on preventing the deterioration of relationships in the Arctic, because that's where, we don't align with Russia on a lot of things, but we align well on the Arctic right now. We both want to get in there. We both want to develop it. We both want to, extract resources from it. If we could work together on that, that would prevent us from doing things like escalating to nuclear conflict over Ukraine or escalating to nuclear conflict over economic issues, because we still have that good relationship that's built on our Arctic cooperation. And then the last piece of evidence here is saying that United States-Russian war is probably the only true existential threat at this moment. Climate change is probably an existential threat, but like what could happen short term that might literally blow up the world? United States, Russia going into nuclear war, which is why we have to maintain those relations very, very well. So the next DISAD area we have is the Chinese or the China DISAD, very, very similar to the Russia DISAD. So first piece of evidence is saying that China views their polar Silk Road as crucial to its geopolitical interests, which basically means that it is um, China is developing in the Arctic significantly right now, and it is crucial to its interest across the entire world. Its development of things like technologies through the Arctic is key to its strategy of influence in countries that are in Latin America, South American countries, African countries, even the European countries, like we talked about earlier. China thinks that its development of the Arctic is key to all of its geopolitical interests. So this, this set is going to be focused more on why United States action is bad, not because it would make, China um, mad that the United States isn't cooperating with it, but rather China would get mad because it would lose influence in the Arctic and it would lose influence geopolitically. So currently, the argument is that the Trump administration has kind of isolated itself from the rest of the world and created a soft power vacuum where, the United States is no longer the country that's going to come to the rescue financially if something is wrong, might not want to work in tandem and cooperation on everything, whereas China has kind of taken up that role and has started, being involved in peace discussions between countries, being the intermediary for a lot of instances, being, the country that smaller countries go to if they need help with, financially, if they need a loan, whatever it might be. China's kind of filling in that role instead of the United States now. And that's happening because of its Arctic influence. Um, and this piece of evidence is saying that if the United States were to start increasing its influence in the Arctic, then that would essentially reverse China's soft power influence right now and prevent China from being able to expand its influence. The next piece of evidence is saying that specifically China's influence is crucial to global leadership and power production outside of the Arctic. What this is saying is that it's almost saying China good, right? It's almost saying that China should be the one that is the soft power negotiator, that is the soft power influence in the entire world, and that their Arctic sphere of influence is crucial to that and crucial to their global leadership, crucial to their ability to prevent things like conflict outside of the Arctic. And this final piece of evidence, the Carter 19, is saying that the loss of that soft power might lock in diversionary conflicts that risk escalation. Because if China is no longer able to influence itself or increase its influence through its Arctic or Polar Silk Road, then it might start trying to increase influence in other ways, such as invading Taiwan or creating diversionary conflicts that could escalate into military scenarios, could escalate into war between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, which is why maintaining their soft power influence through Polar Silk Road is necessary to their ability to influence those other places. Specifically, this card that we have within the extensions argues that the United States decline now is what is allowing Chinese influence to come to the forefront, and why that is necessarily good. For example, you get into into the impacts here a little bit more. It kind of talks about how if they don't have their soft power globally, then they don't have any power or credibility within their country that could cause, rebellion in their country, that could cause just a lot of instability, which is why, that soft power is so necessary. Further impacts on that could say that if they don't maintain their legitimate or the legitimacy in their soft power, they might try to seek that through hard power, through aggression, to maintain its image as one of the big dogs in the geopolitical atmosphere. So if they lose their soft power, they might try to invade Taiwan or something to show that they are still big and strong, which is why the argument on the disset is essentially let's let China maintain their soft power in the Arctic and let's not really do much there. And instead, let's let them be the powerhouse in the Arctic and be a big powerhouse on the global soft power scale to prevent them from doing things like invading Taiwan or escalating conflict with the United States. It's kind of like an appeasement to SAD almost, where we should let China do their thing in the Arctic and not bother them so that they don't get mad and start doing things like invading Taiwan. So yeah, that's the basic structure of that dissent. I'm not going to go over the critiques. And the reason for that is because I think that's a little bit of a deeper discussion than what we have for this video. And we go over, critiques, how to read them and examples of them. So I think that would be a better video to go to learn about the critiques. So that kind of concludes the brief overview and everything we're going to go over today on just everything that you're getting with this brief, and the strategic ways to utilize the affirmatives, and a lot of the off-case positions that we have there. If you have any questions more, feel free to email me, Zach@pocketcoachacademy.com, so we can go. I'll talk to you all day about how to use this brief in the best way. I'll email back and forth with you, do whatever you need to help ensure that your students are, using this brief to the best of their abilities and using it in all the way that it's meant to be used. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And yeah, thank you so much.